Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome our live stream audiences and those of you who watch later on YouTube. We've done over 700 of these shows since the pandemic started, and we have a great author for you today, Professor James Porter from the University of California, Berkeley, and his book is on Homer, the Very Idea. What he means about that is we're going to talk about Homer, but we're even more going to talk about the fact that Homer was basically an idea much more than a person, and a cultural influence much more than a person, and how every period of time kept shifting in their looks at how they thought Homer should be presented to the rest of the public. We do this in our culture. Every culture does this, and Homer is clearly one that has lasted for longer than, well, so far than Taylor Swift and Beyonce, but we'll see. So, Jim, you cover in your book. First of all, welcome to the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much.
It's really a pleasure to have you here, especially on such a nice topic. And you covered so nice and abstractly about the fact that Homer, even 2,800 years ago, people didn't know who he was and who did it, etc. And so Homer has never been a clear character. It probably takes until you get to Pericles or something like that in Greece before you find a real historical character you can put a name to. So let's talk about where Homer originated. That's about 15 different places, right?
Yeah, precisely.
Let's start with that.
Well, the short answer is we don't know. There's no information about Homer that we can use to identify him as an actual living person. And so while every culture does have some sort of anonymous poet or author of a poem that is itself anonymously produced over the centuries or millennia, Homer's unique because we do have two poems by a poet who was thought to have lived sometime around 700, but not even that is clear. Probably there was no such person. There was just a tradition of poets that produced our two greatest epics in the Western tradition, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the astonishing fact about Homer is that along with the two poems came this image of an author. For some reason, there was a need to produce, to generate a concrete person, to give him a life, give him a death, give him an afterlife, etc., make him practically immortal. So that's very unusual in literary traditions, that we would have both a poem and an author who's himself somewhat mythical.
We, of course, are familiar with Shakespeare, and lots of people saying, well, Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. Bacon wrote Shakespeare, or somebody else wrote Shakespeare, and there's all these arguments about it. But the fact is, somebody had to be a very good writer to do this. And I think that that's one of the reasons that Homer's poetry has lasted, is that it's so excellently written. Maybe not 100% of all 15,000 verses, but so often. So why don't you talk about the excellence of the poetry for a little while as to why it's...
Sure. Well, first of all, we have to go back and recognize that Homer was never a writer. The tradition that produced these two poems were oral traditions. They were sung, the verses were memorized, they were improvised for audiences, and from the fall of the Bronze Age, which would have been around 1200 when the Mediterranean city-state culture, the palace culture, collapsed, a set of, possibly even earlier than that, songs about wars and songs about returning heroes from wars came into being at some point, and they eventually consolidated, and we don't know how this happened, but by the time you get to, certainly by the 6th century, we have the full body of poetry, it seems, the equivalent of 2 major novels. No one knew then exactly how they were put together. They simply didn't keep tabs on the oral poets. And so they are extraordinary. Then going back to your question about excellence, they are extraordinary poems by themselves, and they fit almost hand in glove with each other. They have a kind of territorial respect for the other's boundaries. So the Iliad is a story about one hero, Achilles at Troy, and the Odyssey is a story about Odysseus, who returns home after the Trojan War is over, and in many ways, in every other way, they have nothing in common. So they're kind of extraordinary works of art that have been very inspiring, and everyone in ancient Greece and Rome would have known these poems, and by the time they became texts, which would have happened after the introduction of writing, sometime in the 6th century. They may have been recomposed or edited together. There's stories about that. At that point, then we had two rough sets of poems, 24 books each perhaps, maybe not in the form of books, but continuous songs that later became labeled as books. And so they became the bread and butter of Greek and Roman culture. You just grew up learning how to read and write by reciting Homer and putting him onto your chalkboard.
And British schoolboys, 2,500 years later, we're still doing the same
We
thing
still
with their
are,
Greek.
yes,
right?
absolutely.
Still are, yeah. So you mentioned in passing the 1200s, that the major collapse of what was Greek civilization. And a lot of people are aware of this, but I think still it's a really useful setup, because 1200 is right around the time of the Trojan War. Now, the collapse is not blamed on the Trojan War, but could be part of it.
Right.
This is the time when Santorini was supposed to have exploded, and we don't know whether what hurt Crete, but there's that whole period of time, and in Egypt, the Sea Peoples invade around the same time, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of speculation as to what that was, but why don't you give that context about that collapse?
So it's one of the most mystifying historical events that we know of, where an entire civilization or multiple civilizations around the Mediterranean Ocean seem to have fallen apart at the same time, or more or less within 100 or 200 years of each other. And palaces were burnt down and deserted, or not deserted, but were reoccupied on a smaller scale. Troy was one of those, but there were, everywhere you went in the Levant into Turkey, except today's modern-day Turkey, you would find the same kind of collapse. So it's a mystery exactly how this happened. War was involved, but probably environmental factors were also involved. But even there, we don't know exactly what the cause was. Earthquakes and earthquake storms are sometimes brought into the explanation, but that's entirely unknown. In any case, Homer was linked, his story about Troy is linked to this major systems collapse in some way or other, Troy being a major citadel on the Dardanelles. So of course, this background shaped, I think that the background shaped the very reception of Homer. Without this major catastrophic happening in the background, Homer would have just been another poet. But somehow the readers of Homer, or the poets, sensed that there was a major blackout of civilization earlier, some sort of catastrophic happening, and Homer preserves the memory of that. And perhaps that's why that's one of the reasons why he's so attractive and compelling as a writer. He carries within him this kind of sense of cultural trauma as a memory.
You compare this briefly in your book to the Old Testament stories, Jewish stories, where there's this story of the Exodus of Moses, but there's also the story of the flood, which is also it's a story from Babylon, from before, but it's an idea of something catastrophic happened.
Yes.
And since prehistory, we kind of get the idea those things happened all the time, but probably not.
We're waiting to see what epic will be written about 2022.
Exactly. Well, let's hope it's not about this particular interview.
We'll find out. I hope not.
Yeah.
But yes, so against that backdrop, that may be, I suggest that that's one of the reasons why Homer was such an important figure, because there was a dim memory of something that was lost in this entire civilization. And so we have to recall that the poems, in the form that we have them, the date is sometimes said to be around 700, when these various songs called lays were fused together into longer poems. But we don't know exactly when that happened. But anyway, certainly by the 6th century. something attracted audiences to this magical, disastrous happening, the fall of Troy.
You know, it's interesting because, and we'll get back to this, I think, towards the end of our conversation. But you mentioned a very big theme, which is how 1/3 of the verses are about war and battle scenes and so on.
Yep.
And why are we? People keep asking over the centuries, why are we so attracted to this idea? But even at the time when when the poems were becoming famous and becoming popular, 6th century, 5th century BC, this idea that yes, we do engage in war, but we could be noble about it.
Right.
Right? Something that redeems us from the
Right.
total shame
Yes.
of what we do in war, maybe.
So that's often, that's one of the, I mean, there are many reasons why today and over the centuries people have turned to Homer. First of all, they're in some way romantically attractive. You have Achilles, this extraordinary noble fighter. We have Helen, the most beautiful woman in the ancient world, who's been abducted to Troy by Priam's son, Alexander, or Paris, as he's called, which unleashes the wrath of the Greeks on the mainland, and they come to get her. And then Odysseus with his return home after this very long, weary 10-year war, and then another 10-year journey before he finally gets back home. So there's a kind of built-in, it's almost like a melodrama in some way. There's also a great deal of beauty and possibilities for hope at the end of the poem, where Achilles and Priam, the king of Troy, get together and basically break bread and decide to hold off until Hector's body, which Achilles had slain, could be returned to the castle. And then, of course, a week later, or 4 days later, the Greeks come and sack the place. So it's a very ambivalent kind of story. It's heart-wrenching in some ways, both of these stories are. But you can also imagine that there was a great deal of ambivalence about the value of war. And so I think that we tend to over-romanticize a little bit the Homeric stories. And part of what I'm trying to do in my book is to point to some of the ways in which things are not quite as pretty as they seem to be, the way we read them, if we actually pay attention to what's going on in the poems.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of readers that just, kind of ignored the facts on the page in order to get what they wanted out of it. You also, before we go into the pictures, you talked about how vivid the pictures are that are created by Homer.
Yes.
And of course, that's what makes a great movie. That's what makes a great, the visual imagery that gets stuck in people's mind. And you mentioned one particular thing, which was a wall that was built by the Greeks. And it's described differently in different places, but obviously it must have been enormous. And then you think that this was undoubtedly a fiction, whether it ever happened or not, or whether he even knew whether it happened. It was a nice, vivid image. Right. And so you say that this has to be destroyed. And so why don't you tell that story?
Okay, sure. So first of all, let's talk about vividness. The Greek word is enargeia. It means extremely vivid and energetic and in your visually impressive. So Homer's poems have the reputation of being extremely vivid. But when you look closely at the poems, you find that a lot of things are simply not described. And one of them is we don't get very good pictures of what Troy is like either. No one actually could vouch for the fact that Troy, which Homer, the poets would have known after the 12th century, was in ruins and half buried under rubble. So he had to have recreated something out of nothing. A problem happened later on when people started trying to identify the geographical location of the real Troy, and they couldn't find it. And part of the reason was that Homer's descriptions just didn't hold up. There just wasn't enough there, and the ones that he gave were unclear. Was Scamander this river or that river, and so on. So the possibility that Homer was such a good visualizer suggested also that he might have actually made things up. And this idea influenced readings of this particular structure you're calling the Trojan, the Achaean Wall, the Greek Wall, which they built overnight. In Book 7, they decided in the 10th year of a war, all of a sudden they had to defend themselves against the invading barbarians, although they were the ones who were the barbarians invading. And they put together the structure, which is, if you look at it in the details, is structurally incoherent. Sometimes it looks like it's another Troy, as big as Troy on a smaller scale, but at least having parapets and defensive walls and ramparts and so on. And other times it looks like it's something that could just be torn apart with a hero's hands. So it's a strange, rickety contraption. And there is an explanation of why Homer might have put that there, and that is because he was not allowed by the tradition, which was had a strict set of rules, to actually show Troy being taken. So what does he do? He gives us an ersatz Troy, which can be taken. So then we have this other problem, which is, all right, so then he, at the in the middle of the book, of the Iliad, in Book 12, he has the gods destroy it, as you were mentioning. And the question is, why did he take so much trouble to build it, and why does he take so much trouble telling us it's gone? And at that moment, and it's an extraordinary scene, and it is like a natural catastrophe. Rivers and the gods, 3 gods, get together, Apollo, Zeus, and Neptune, or Poseidon, and they destroy the place and level it and erase it so that it was back to its pristine, original, sandy sandy whatever locale. All the traces of this wall were erased. It's almost as if Homer had just simply taken an eraser and destroyed what he had built. And this is what Aristotle actually says. Not a problem. Homer is a poet. He has the right to make things disappear. So this raises the question of what else is missing, and why did he make it disappear? And later scholars got together and they came up with this idea that perhaps Homer destroyed it so that no one could ever find it and realize that he had made it up. Total circular thinking. But what shows you the kind of depth of sophistication that the Greeks could have about their own iconic canonical works, such as Homer, and the poet himself, Homer, which is something that we don't do very well with our own writers today.
Well, I was thinking that in current literature, the thing that it reminded me the most is the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, because in all the movies, there it is, it's this big, huge creation, but each movie has a different version of it. They're not all the same. They're all slightly different models or whatever, and it changes over time. Of course, it's magical, so of course it can do that. But it stands in as something that, it's clearly one of the crucial players in the whole series is this castle, but that doesn't mean it has to be solid. And I think J.K. Rowling is a classicist sufficiently to, I think, have done that on purpose.
Okay, that's very good.
Yeah. So we're talking about images. You have some images. Now, before we show the images, it's important to know that this doesn't mean that this is what it looked like. This isn't what Homer looked like. Yeah. So
let's start with the first. So here's the Louvre Homer, and it's a bust. It was probably Hellenistic in era. A recreation of what Homer might have looked like. And the important thing to note here is that Homer's eyes, he has no pupils, he's blind. And he's old and he looks very serene. He has a strap across his head, which indicates a kind of some sort of cultic aspect of sorts. Homer was imagined as a blind poet, and this goes right to your point about about the clarity of his perception. At the same time, the clarity came from where exactly? Not from his eyes, but from something else. So we have the choice how to analyze that, and one possibility is that he got his visual inspiration from the muses, as he says, sing to me, muse. But the muses could see, but he could not. And the other option is that, as later on happened, this is the extraordinary thing. Homer became as powerful a story as the Iliad and Odyssey themselves. He was given a life. He was described as having been born from different kinds of circumstances. And in many of these stories, which are an actual genre in antiquity called the biographies or lives of poets, and Homer had the most and the longest, in those stories, he was often said to have lived up to 160 to 400 years after the event. So again, what exactly does that imply? But anyway, there were so many different types, statuary types of busts of Homer, and even full-length statues. We have none. This is one example, and they're simply made up in the mind of the sculptor themselves, whoever it was.
Just for the audience, Homer wasn't the only one who could be convincing, saying that the Muses just inspired me and told me what everything was like. I mean, there were plenty of other examples at that time of people who said that they were inspired by the Muses and that was their role in life, and therefore, and even Socrates, the height of rationality, said that he had a daemon,
that's very interesting.
Something that would speak in his ear and give him impressions that he was going to follow. So this was sort of part of even the most rational end of the society.
It was. The ancient Greeks were not immune to believing in magic, and believing in the gods, believing in inspiration that comes from on high, and so on. So yes, that was part of the picture. And in many ways, I think Homer had a closer relationship to the Muses than any other poet. He had seemed to be a kind of personal. They were his personal ties to the divine, whereas Hesiod, another poet, simply says that the Muses came and gave him the power of song, whereas Homer actually speaks to them, and so it's almost as if he's looking over his shoulder or up above, and makes the audience feel intimately involved with the divine. So there's a certain magic that goes on with that as well.
A magic that Socrates' student Plato was upset by because he didn't like the way the gods were being described.
That's
he
right.
thought they're not being very divine; they're being very human.
So. Hence the paradox.
Yeah.
Homer being at one time elevated into a divinity, and at other times he's kicked out of Plato's Republic. He's not allowed to live there because he's too damaging morally. And this kind of critique goes way back to Xenophanes and Heraclitus, the early pre-Socratic thinkers, who both contested the authority of Homer and said that he was blind epistemologically. He just couldn't see things, and he just didn't know what reality was, according to Heraclitus. And for Xenophanes, he was, as Plato thought too, someone who maligned the gods, had them do indecent things. And the Greeks, I think, probably were more like audiences of Harry Potter than they were real believers in the actual divinity of their gods. I would venture to say they had fun with their literature, and I think much the way, maybe more so than we do, because they had this kind of intimacy that we no longer have.
It's always fun to think that the same mistakes you make are made by the gods too, so it can't be that bad.
So another example of someone who was inspired is a poet called Stesichorus from around 600 BC, so well before, a century before Xenophanes and Heraclitus. And he stages a poem in which he says that it wasn't true, we hear this from Plato, it wasn't true that Helen sailed to Troy. You never went there. And he creates this counter story, a counter epic, in which not she, but a divine image, an eidolon, shaped out of clouds and mist, goes to Troy, and the Greeks end up fighting over nothing, basically a phantom. So this is an extraordinary takedown, and he claims to have the authority of Helen herself. And so Homer's authority was being contested right from the very beginning, and was always thought to have been contested.
Contested, but the fact that his poetry was so good made him the winner in the long run.
Everybody wanted to one-up him, exactly. So this kind of it was like a pebble under the foot in a shoe that generated a great deal of. No one knew for sure exactly what the story with Homer was, but because he wasn't there to defend his reputation, it was very easy to go ahead and challenge it. So we hear stories later. Even Aristotle indicates two poets who lived at the time of Homer and claimed that they had written their own version of the Iliad before he had. So the very fact that these stories existed suggests that the ancients were pretty well aware that Homer was not the first to come along, and they didn't have a scientific understanding of oral poetry, but they knew that there was something wrong here. Same had to do with his name. His name was completely made up. No one knew what it actually was. And it had many different meanings. One was blind, one was that he was a hostage. Trying to think of other meanings. There were several different meanings that were assigned to the name Homer, but he also had other names like Meleagros, and he's more often called that than he is called Homer, or Melesigenes. So this too was part of the mystique that circulated around Homer.
Sort of like Prince.
Maybe.
Person once named Prince.
So let's see what else we have here. This is a painting from the early 19th century by, which is representing a coronation of Homer by Ingres, the French painter. He was a classicizing painter. And this is a wonderful tableau which shows different figures from, if I can go down here, Longinus, Boileau looking at Longinus, who's writing a commentary, a literary commentary on Homer, and Pericles, you mentioned before, Pisistratus, who's holding the scroll of Homer's poetry that he would have apparently commissioned a group of scholars to get together, or bards, and to create the poems as we know them. This is an apocryphal story, but it just indicates how little was actually known. The funny thing here is that he's holding a copy of Homer, and so is Homer. And Homer couldn't write, but
Right.
So then we have here, just very quickly, the Iliad and the Odyssey, blood red with a sword, and an allegorical figure of the Odyssey with a broken oar representing Odysseus's travels. So this was the classicizing image that carried on that ancient idea that Homer was godlike or divinity, and it still is, in a sense, what is being taught in classes today, which is that Homer is the greatest poet in the West, which may well be true, but that's just half the story. That's just where what counts as being great, I guess, is the question we need to ask.
Yeah, not necessarily content.
No. So.
You make an interesting point in your book too about how the head in this picture by Ingres is sort of dead looking, and it's based upon the sculpture.
So this is the interesting question: is he being coronated? Is he being divinized? And is he being? The painting is called the Apotheosis of Homer, and it's modeled after an ancient Hellenistic apotheosis sculpture, relief sculpture, which I have a picture of later. So the question is here: is he alive or is he dead, or is he on his way to becoming immortal, or is he already dead? And obviously, for us, he's dead, but it's not clear whether he's alive or dead. His toe looks to be very alive in the front there, and he's got a muscular build, so we can't really say for sure, but he is sitting on a marble tombstone that indicates that he's already died. So we have a tension in the image. Let me see if I have another picture here. This is the ancient Apotheosis of Homer from the 3rd century, found in Rome, but probably Alexandrian. And Homer is here. It's the same gesture. We have here two Greek patrons, the kings of king and queen of Egypt, of Alexandria, putting a crown or wreath on Homer, and then the various literary genres coming up to pay their obeisance to the great poet. And at the very top is Zeus and the Muses, who seem to be the place where he got his inspiration and his authority. Question is going to be is whether he's being apotheosized or just simply canonized. What's very interesting too is the fact that the Zeus and the Muses' memory don't seem very interested in him. So there's a kind of a gap, and Homer is being brought down several levels below the level of the gods. So we see that there's a kind of ambiguity here, whether Homer is divine or just simply a human who has certain good connections upstairs. And at the base here, we can't see them here, but are mice nibbling away at what looks like a manuscript, which may be his own book, which may suggest the possibility that Homer's permanence was fragile. It was recognized that it could be his books could end up in as moldy leftovers in the bookstore someday, just rotting away. This never actually happened, and works like this made sure that it never did.
Yeah. you have a chapter called Apotheosis or Aposty.
Yes.
And maybe more people are aware of the word aposty because it's used in other connections, but maybe you can explain those two words and how they're used.
Yeah, sure. So apotheosis just means deification. Apostasy just means rejecting a kind of religious belief, standing aside. It literally means standing off to the side or standing away from. And so that's how I outlined two different ways that Homer was being received in antiquity, understood, and one was this very positive God, deifying, elevating, classicizing, perhaps, reading, and the other was taking him down. And we can see some of that ambivalence here, the way Plato would, or the way Zoilus, who's called the scourge of Homer, because he whipped Homer with his criticisms and showed how foolish Homer made some of his heroes appear. For instance, Diomedes, a Greek hero, it looks like he has flames coming out of his helmet, and Zoilus, who was writing around the time of Plato, said, "This is silly. It looks like he's going to catch on fire." Yeah. So, to be able to have that kind of margin of that room for maneuver with Homer is extraordinary. He could be both elevated to the gods and kicked down into the gutter or out of these contests, as he was by Heraclitus. With another, he said, Heraclitus said, Homer must be thrown out of the agones, the musical contests, with a rhabdos, with his own stick, the stick that he's holding here, which indicates his own kingly status as a poet.
Well, we do the same thing with celebrities today, right? We deify them, and then we have several magazines devoted to making their clay feet shown.
Right. Very, very, very right. Yes, true. And this is, I think, probably universal in culture, but Homer really got the worst of it.
Well, tell the story of what they said about how he died, with the Delphic Oracle.
Okay, sure. So
it's just just to show how low the story can get.
Let's see if I have a picture here. We'll come back to this maybe later. So there is one of the works which is called the Contest of Homer and Hesiod, which belongs to that genre of literary lives. But it's in many ways a compilation. The last hand that we know about that added anything to it would have been Alcidamas, who lived also around the time of Plato. And Homer wanders around the countryside, increasingly blind, and we get different variations. In fact, we get different lives mushed together into this one particular one, where there's a contest between the two poets to see who is the better poet. Homer loses, which is an extraordinary thing by itself, against the urgings of the Greek demos, as said, who really thought that Homer should have won. And then he goes off a few adventures, makes some more poetry, writes his Iliad and Odyssey, because in these stories he's literate, and then eventually ends up on Ios. Two points that come up here. One is that he, at some point, goes to the Delphic Oracle, I think that's what you were mentioning, to ask, where did I come from? Who is my mother? Who is my father? And the oracle said, beware of Ios, because there your death will lie. You don't go to that island, and that's where you maybe are from. It was said to be one of the places that he could have come from. So he somehow stumbles into Ios at the end of his life, and he says, the oracle said, beware of the riddle of the fishing boys. He sees or hears two fishing boys, or several fishing boys. There, right? They're right there. This is a later representation from Pompeii. And it's written above is Homer's name, and Hales, which means fisher boys. And they present him with a riddle. He says, what are you doing? And they said, well, what we caught, we left behind, and what we haven't caught, we carried. What we caught, we took with us, and what we couldn't, sorry, let me try one more time. What we caught and saw, we left behind, but what we couldn't see, we took with us. Yeah. And the answer to that riddle was lice. And
lice. So lice has been around.
Lice have been here forever. A very demeaning kind of episode where the great riddler, who had beaten Hesiod in riddling contests, can't even handle two whippersnappers on the seashore. And so he stumbles on the mud, a few days later dies, and then he writes this epitaph to himself, which was what we saw at the base of the Apotheosis by Ingres, the French painter. And here, this wall painting has in it the riddle itself. It's almost as if the riddle was more famous than it's the exact same scenario. He's sitting at a throne, but he's being dethroned by two little kids.
So I think one of the things that's very useful to talk about this is a fresco in a home in Pompeii that was uncovered recently, but it was, of course, painted 2,000 years ago when Homer was already 700 years into being famous.
Yes.
So this is a little like pictures of George Washington in lots of people's homes, and
Yes.
that Homer is everywhere.
Yes.
And that he's a cultural icon.
Yeah.
Or I thought also maybe Robin Hood. That there's all these stories of Robin Hood, and the images are there. And you mentioned the fact that he's both a generic image and a specific one. And I think Robin Hood kind of fits that. He's got green tights and a certain hat, but he doesn't always have the same beard, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that's right. So he's recognizable as Homer, perhaps. This is a very realistic portrait in many ways. It was, I'm not sure, I think it was found in the late 18th century and it was restored and drawn. This was a drawing made in the 19th century, and it's very much faded now. But yes, that's the interesting thing, is that he was depicted in so many different ways throughout antiquity, and it's almost as if audiences were responding to the person more than the poems. Yeah, and that's part of the reason why the theme, one of the main themes of my book, is this question whether Homer, which is actually a restatement of a thesis by Vico, and also by Nietzsche, the philosopher, whether Homer was a person who was later made into an idea, or was he an idea that was made into a person? And there seems to be no way of getting around, we can't figure out which of these is right, but we can't somehow not imagine an author of the poems. And yet we have to recognize that it's nothing more than a colorful idea.
Chicken and egg question, but in this case, I think when it comes to authors, very few people feel that really excellent writing can be done by a committee. I mean, that a lot of people are. So maybe some poem did the best part, some poet did the best parts, and then other ones collected them, revised them, put things in. I mean, there are posthumous novels by different authors that were put together by the editors.
Yes.
Where the bulk of it was done by the actual writer, and they're so familiar with their writing that they can fill in the gaps, and a good literary critic can see where the mistakes
the themes are. Yes,
but still most of it is done by the original author.
Yeah,
something like that.
So that was a suspicion. There were thoughts that maybe what we have in Homer today, or which is what the Alexandrians had in the 3rd century at the Library of Alexandria, was not the Homer that was passed down through the generations. We just don't know for sure. But that was a conclusion that Friedrich August Wolff, a great philologist, who wrote a prolegomena to Homer in 1795, floated for the first time, which was that the poems were, in fact, put together by later people who came along and supplemented what was missing, and produced a text that had no real, it did have a kernel of authentic Homericity, if you like, and he thought it was the first, I think, 16 books that he thought were Homer's and not the last 8. But how did he know? How could we ever tell? So the thought would drive you mad if you tried to pick apart the layers of Homer. But that is the fact that the poems came to us very much scarred by the tradition that sent them down to us, and so we good scholars tend to see these seams or these places where the stitching is falling apart a bit, and that's a very destructive way of reading, and I'm not sure we can actually confirm it in our mind. So that was not my issue in this book per se.
No,
I think if anything, I was trying to show that the Greeks were as capable of having doubts and nonetheless working with what they had as we are today. We haven't really progressed much further.
No, we haven't. But speaking of progression, our live stream audience, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask of Professor Porter, just send them in through the chat room and I'll get a hold of them.
Okay.
So we skipped a
see
couple
what
pictures.
else.
Do you want to back up? And
Maybe so. Let's see what I'm trying to remember what I have.
this is where
so-
we mentioned that about the dead head. On
Yes, I think
body.
that's what you were referring to. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a sketch by Ingres and made around the time that he was making studies for his Apotheosis. An extraordinary image. I call it the cyborg Homer, because his head is actually modeled after a marble Louvre statue, and it's affixed on this living body. And behind him is Orpheus, one of the precursors to the Homeric poems, according to ancient mythology, whispering we don't know what into Homer's ears if he can actually hear them. So this, to me, sums up the tradition in so many different ways of how we understand Homer as being both alive and dead and somehow lasting eternally, but also mortal and fleshly and fragile. And I think that keeping all of these extremes together in our minds is probably the richest way of understanding what Homer's doing.
Yeah, layers. All right.
So let me see what we have here.
This was very interesting.
So this is So here we have another study that was made by Ingres at the time, and it's the title is Tradition on a Pedestal. And the tradition turns out to be very much Homer. He is the tradition, but he's been hollowed out and made into a silhouette. And so in my mind, that to me is what tradition is. It's this outline that it gets filled in as as it progresses through the eras. And here we have a kind of X-ray vision of what that tradition is.
A politician's ideal, right? To be
faceless and
an X
something to everybody.
can decide who you are and vote for.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit like Helen too. She was.
Oh yeah, the most beautiful woman in the world, but we don't ever see what she looks
exactly.
like, right?
Yes, I can imagine.
Because then everybody would argue. No, it's this one. You know.
That's right.
We have one question right about this the picture,
Okay.
so I'm going to ask it right now.
Right.
So regarding the image, like Ingres's Apotheosis, how many people would have seen paintings like this back when it was done? And is that similar to the social media of the time? In other
Yes.
words, it would get displayed, so that's the question. So it would be in the
Absolutely.
museum, and how many people would come to see it?
Okay.
Thousands.
If we're talking, yes, I mean,
Yeah.
so Ingres' painting was one of the most famous at the time, 1824 or 5, and it was
We're talking post Napoleon.
yes, and it was and also post David, so the other his competitor, but it was also put together. It was displayed in I forget now the name. It was like a kind of World's Fair held in France. So it received lots of likes, if you like, and that is one of the ways in which audiences made contact with the past through paintings and sculptures. And so he's just carrying on that tradition. So that's an excellent question. I think there's one other point, I suppose, is that you can precisely measure the popularity of a figure like Homer by how many images he had. The way we would have, so many hits on a Facebook site, as it were.
And there was probably cheating. Is that just like there is in the Soviet Union? How many Lenin statues there are doesn't mean how popular he was. So we social media also has its cheaters.
Yes, I'm sure
how many
that's
likes
true.
there are. They get all their friends to do it 10 times, whatever.
Yeah, it's very hard to tell. But yes, that would be.
But generally, it's an accurate way to do it, right?
Yeah, that would be the closest there was to something like our social media in the ancient days. I don't think I have too many more images to show. Let me see what is here. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, here's one more. Why not imagine Homer as a woman? But
Great idea.
Samuel Butler did. He created this person, the Nausicaa, the muse. He said his muse, who was the authoress of the Odyssey. He wrote a book in the 1890s. It's a hilarious send-up of scholarship, and he found this painting. It's a long story, but he found this painting in Crotona in a museum, and decided that was the authoress of the Odyssey. And the interesting thing is that he can't be disproved. Right. Nor could you prove anything about Homer either. So that was part of his point. He was actually what he was doing was not simply spoofing Homer, but he was drawing on the traditions itself that he knew about from the second sophistic writers, Dio Chrysostom, Philostratus, and so on, who challenged Homer and made fun of him and said that the Trojan War never actually ended the way Homer said, and Troy was never captured, and Helen never went there after all, etc. So he fits into that tradition too. It's a very learned spoof, if you like.
Yeah, and Samuel Butler was quite a scoundrel in the way he liked to write about everything. I mean,
oh yes,
he took everything down in very, very funny ways. So I had not heard of this, but it certainly fits his other writing. And I think just to complete the historical arc for people quickly, we were in Pompeii, and then a couple hundred years later, Greek wasn't studied anymore, basically, and the Latin Empire, the Roman Empire went down. So for maybe 1,000 years, there was almost no Greek, so there was no Homer because there was no Greek. So
that's right.
Homer disappears for a while, and then he's brought back by Petrarch, and the Renaissance gets them. Like everything in the Renaissance, everything classical was wonderful, and then another couple hundred years later, we have all the critics coming back.
Yes, yeah.
And so that's where we are with Butler and Nietzsche and so on and so forth,
Yes.
where we've arrived at that point.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, with Petrarch, just remember he didn't actually know Greek, so he commissioned a translation from a manuscript. It was the first Latin translation, a terrible one, but this was in 1363, 65, and then eventually better translations were made, and Homer became legible again, and eventually editions in Greek, critical editions, started to appear, and that's when Homer gained a footing. There was always a kind of seesaw effect, but seesaw struggle between Virgil and Homer. Whenever Latinity was on the rise, Virgil did well, and when Greek came back in, and not just Philhellenism, but mania of some sort, then Homer did well.
These cultural, intellectual fights, like between Homer and Virgil, and between Plato and Aristotle in the Middle Ages, are kind of funny. You know, it's like nobody imagines the fights. Well, at least ever since Gore Vidal and Buckley.
We forget about them.
We don't think. Yes.
Yeah, no, there were actual almost world wars were waged among scholars over whether Homer was or wasn't a good poet.
Right.
And the critiques came very quickly, but also before they crept up, we have to remember that Dante, in his trilogy, The Divine Comedy, actually is led by the hand by Virgil, but he calls Homer the poeta sovrano, the supreme poet, although he never had read him either because there were no translations available. So it's an interesting balancing point. But then, yes, then the culture wars really took off again in the 18th century and all the way up through Nietzsche as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and beyond.
Yeah. It's not over yet.
I hope not.
All right. Any other images?
That may be the end. Let's see. This is just
Troy, right?
A picture of Troy with its many layers. And I introduced this in the book to make a comparison with a short story by Borges called The Immortal. I recommend it to everybody. It's just 15 pages of mind-blowing madness in which Homer is reincarnated over and over again. But the interesting thing about the story is that he ends up in a kind of inverted Troy, which has as many layers as this particular. This is a 19th century post-Schliemann map of the 9 layers of Troy, and representing from the top the most modern to the bottom, which go well before the time when Homer would have written his poems or sang his poems. I'm sorry. And Schliemann was the one who discovered this. He dug a little bit too deeply, and he ended up back in the early Bronze Age, and he was looking for Homer's Troy, and he never found it. And the interesting question today is, have we actually got it? And it's not at all clear that this is the Troy that Homer would have either seen or not seen. Yeah.
The Schliemann story is almost as good as the Homer story versus the poems, because yes, he found Troy, but did he really find Troy? And did he find the right Troy?
Right.
And he put all the gold on his wife, and had her take pictures of it with all the
Oh yes,
all the personal stuff. And was he crazy, or did he know what he was doing? And that's all almost as interesting, to everybody. As is this a really good way to describe what happened on the site, which we call Troy, over the centuries or over the millennia, you should say.
Yeah. So what you're talking about there is this incredible passion that the search for Troy or the search for Homer still instilled in someone like Schliemann, complete romantic. But he had enough money to make his dreams come true, and he did everything to verify what he thought was the case. Yeah, absolutely.
Just the kind of thing that when we're looking at how we've lived our lives, and we want to see how other people have lived their lives, and these extremes make us more comfortable with being a little bit more mediocre.
Perhaps so, yes. Yeah, so I don't think I have any, no, I just have this last image,
perfect.
which is advertising.
Yeah.
But here we have the three different versions of Homer, from marble bust to the drawing by that was used for the apotheosis by Ingres to the cyborgian Homer at the very bottom.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Nietzsche.
Okay.
He's always interesting.
All right.
So he comes on, and he just has a lot of different ideas, which he just doesn't. In
Join us this New
short
Year for new
pieces,
conversations at the
getting everybody
Commonwealth Club.
thinking. But he's both for classicism and against it, and so on and so forth. So why don't you tell a little bit of how he reacted to Homer?
Well, first of all, Nietzsche was an incredibly gifted young classicist who got tenure before he actually published a dissertation or had actually written one. He got tenure based on a few articles that he had done. And then for his official speech when he was in Basel in Switzerland, he gave a presentation on Homer and classical philology, which was a very paradoxical kind of piece, worrying about whether we can actually say we know the real Homer is and why that's so difficult to assemble. What kind of fiction is necessary for us in order to be able to read the poems? Can we read the poems without imagining a single author for them? And it's very difficult to do. The coherence of the poems, and I think this is what he's getting at, is overwhelmingly indubitable. There's just no way that we can. I think if they were produced by a series of bards over centuries, we can only admire the ingenuity of these very sort of, to us, primitive, but in fact very sophisticated poets who were able to put together these extraordinary scenes. I could say a little more about Nietzsche if you're interested. Okay, yeah. So then in the later eras, Nietzsche came back to Homer actually right away. That was in 1869 when he gave this particular speech on Homer and classical philology, which left everybody in the audience scratching their heads. What is he saying? Can we actually know Homer? Was he going against the German scholastic tradition or not? And in 1872, he produced another couple of essays on Homer, and Homer, and was bringing out this notion that I think he was trying to embarrass us with this question that you mentioned earlier. Why is it that we're so attracted to a work of art that is so involved with bloody mayhem and danger and death? And his answer is that seems to be that we have very dark aspects in our souls, and we don't always confess to that, and so we transfigure the dark appreciation for death, etc., which we lust after in some strange way, into an aesthetic beauty of some sort. So he was attacking this aestheticization of Homer and questioning the hypocrisy of readers who can, like Goethe and Winckelmann and others, who just saw nothing but beauty when they looked at Homer and could ignore the bloodshed that was everywhere. That inaugurated an entire critique of war in Homer into the early 20th century, when during the war, middle of the 20th century, when war was actually raging, we had four Jewish-German authors, each of them devoted a long essay or a book to Homer and the Iliad, or Homer and the Odyssey. So Simone Weil, Homer, the Poem of Force, or Rachel Bespalov on Homer, both of them from the early 1940s. Erich Auerbach's first chapter on Odysseus' Scar, and Adorno and Horkheimer in their Dialectic of Enlightenment. And in every case, they critiqued the premise of taking pleasure in a war poem. So this goes back to your initial point, which is, can we simply ignore the violence? Can we aestheticize it? Can we beautify it and make ourselves feel better by doing what I would call reparative readings, where we repair the damage by overlooking the damage itself? And these are probably the three or four most powerful readings of Homer that I've come across myself. Very, very. They're attacking not Homer. They're attacking readings of Homer, the way in which he was being read at the time, and of course the Nazis appropriated Homer as well. So,
right. And they appropriated Nietzsche.
Through a bad reading of Nietzsche, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's unfortunate.
It's interesting that he makes this point, which would seem to undercut the nobilization of violence under the Nazis, but that didn't stop them either. And just like you said about Homer.
Yeah.
And one other comment that I had about when you're talking about Nietzsche, I think writers most of the time are going to make the assumption about Homer, about the plays, the poems,
yes,
that they were written by mostly one person.
Yes.
Because they know what it takes to write something coherent, how hard that is.
Yeah.
How hard is it for more than one person to do that in one piece of literature? Very hard.
Very hard, but very possible.
Possible.
And it's very likely that, in fact, the opposite was the case. I think that it was really a tradition that was so sophisticated that it preserved, it produced complexity, maybe because it was so diffused, and was nonetheless coherent in a way. And then someone came along, perhaps as an editor, and put the parts together, but they were already implicitly there. It's impossible to know. We just simply... We can't do it. So the question is, can we read without that assumption or not? And is that the only thing that matters when we look at a poem?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, and you bring it up, that this way to analyze Homer and the poems, literary criticism, is also what was applied to the Bible at the same time, especially in Germany, et cetera, from the 18th century, 19th century. There was a whole trend towards that. And that same kind of criticism, which I thought must have been awfully fun for the professors that got involved in it, were the linguistics at the time of figuring out that actually all of our languages have roots that are very similar. And that some languages are connected with each other and some of them aren't. That was also the same 18th, 19th century linguistic criticism studies that were going on.
Yeah, eventually this Indo-European notion came up as the common mother of all languages. But at the same time, and this is the unfortunate thing about the German tradition, is that it was greatly influenced by biblical criticism that was just beginning to take root in the end of the 18th century. But at the same time, it was somewhat of a toxic environment. It was a very anti-Semitic way of going about things. Woolf himself excluded the study of the Near East as being not on the same level in terms of literature and culture as the civilization of Greece and Rome.
Right.
So that, unfortunately, that came with, that was part of that tradition as well.
Came with the territory.
Yep.
It's the same thing. Hegel did this great study of history, but then, of course, he decided that the 19th century in Germany was the height.
Yeah.
How can you... even great analysts seem to succumb to this kind of, personal bias almost immediately. Hard to get out of it, that's for sure.
Yeah. There's been some very interesting work done recently by a colleague of mine, Ron Hendel, in the Near Eastern Studies program, showing, and he's not alone, indicating that Exodus was itself a kind of invented myth, that very much the way the Greeks seem to have invented their own myth about their ancestry belonging to the invaders of Troy. And so this gives a somewhat different kind of spin on the way Homer is being used as a kind of national icon. He was used to develop a kind of nationalism, some sort.
Right. No, we have a couple more questions.
Okay, okay, fine.
One of them we talked a little bit about, but you can say some more. Paul Switzer asks, was there a period post-antiquity when Homer was mostly forgotten or ignored? So,
the one you mentioned, in the medieval period, when Greek was no longer read except in the East and Byzantium, and Greek texts were inaccessible and wouldn't have been able to be translated until much later anyway. In their place, what they had were pseudo fictions by Dares and Dictys, two sorts of forgeries, which claim to have been written by individuals who were present at Troy, present before Homer was at Troy, and actually knew what was going on in Troy. And so this is another example of this kind of one-upsmanship. I was going to say the medieval traditions almost supplanted Homer, but only because he was just not available. And then once he was brought back in, they were discredited.
Yeah. And Paul Sutzer asked a follow-up question, which was, how about in Byzantium, which you mentioned?
Yeah.
How about, what did Homer last during the entire time?
The entire time. He was always there. He was always available.
Yeah.
We have commentaries from, one of the best is by Eustathius, who lived around 1200, and he wrote 2 massive volumes of commentary on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it's thanks to him and people like him who were in his period. There were others as well. What they did was basically collect the wisdom of earlier scholarship and put it into its own kind of package, and used it for teaching students in the schools how to read Homer. They were like commentaries that we would have today in the classroom.
So another couple of historical areas. So there's the library in Alexandria that flourished until 400
Yes.
AD, and then there was the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which went around and collected all those things. Now, we know that in Alexandria that Homer was a very important figure still. But my question is, I know that they did Plato and they did other Greeks and stuff like that in Baghdad. That's around the 700, 800, something like that.
Yeah.
Do you know whether they looked into Homer?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
No, these were probably Islamic philosophers,
Right.
and they were interested in translating Plato, but especially Aristotle.
Right.
And it was because of their activity that Aristotle was resuscitated and revived all the way into the early modern era.
Right.
Homer, I don't believe so. I'm not aware of anything like that. Yeah.
Great.
It's not to say that there weren't readers of Homer in that part of the world.
But it wasn't. But it wasn't.
It was not a center of scholarship.
Part of it, because they brought in information from India, and it was a great university center. If it might not be called a university, but something like that. So one last question.
Okay.
So you're obviously lived a big part of your professorial life and academic intellectual life being part of the cultural conversation about Homer. So how did you find Homer as a place to make part of your life with intellectually?
Yeah. Well. First of all, as a classicist, it's impossible not to. He was the first text that I read in Greek, actually. It was a very unwise decision, but I was in high school, and there was a Jesuit textbook by Schrader and Schrader, I think it was called, or Schroeder and Schroeder, and it was it introduced you to Greek the easy way by reading passages of the Odyssey. It ruined my Greek, because that's not what you're supposed to do. You have to go through the Attic system and then go back to Homer, which I eventually did. And it was impossible to avoid teaching him, but I love to teach Homer. It's one of my favorite forms of literature. There's no question. So I've been thinking about Homer forever, probably 20 years, at least 20 odd years. And this is an embarrassing fact, but I secured a contract for this book in 2005 around, and I didn't get to it until 2021, and because I had just too many other things to do in between, and then I started working in earnest on the book, and wrote to my editor, who's a wonderful editor at Susan Bilstein at Chicago. And she said, "Oh, no. You're writing way too much. This is supposed to be a kind of trade book for lowbrow scholarship, et cetera, and make it accessible and short." And I had a heart attack, and I don't do very well with writing short. But I did sit down and actually try to compress everything into about 200 odd pages, which ended up being what happened. And
well, you say you didn't do a good job of it, but you did a very good job of it. And I think everybody will appreciate both this hour of look into your scholarship on Homer and also the book.
Thank you.
For those who are interested in more details.
Okay.
So thank you very much for joining us. So ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 119th year of enlightened discussion. Thanks for joining us. See you again.